This is the week 7 presentation for WLC 310 Cultures of Italy. And this week's topic is the Italian diaspora, which refers to the large group of immigrants from Italy and their descendants. We're going to be reviewing 2 articles, a book, and a movie, which each offer a different perspective on the Italian diaspora. I'm going to be reviewing a chapter from Anna Cento-Boll's book, Modern Italy, a very short introduction. The chapter is titled Immigration, Immigration, and Citizenship. We'll be starting with immigration. From the time Italy unified in 1861 until about the 1970s, it has produced a lot of immigrants. And again, economic conditions have increased immigration from about the 1990s to today. These immigrants often send money back to their home families in Italy, which overall increases living conditions in Italy. Until about World War I, it was more common for them to return after a time, but after World War I, they more often settled in their destination country. The most common destination for Northern Italians immigrants was other countries in Europe, but Southern Italians more often emigrated to farther places like the United States, Latin America, or Australia. She specifies the United States, and Argentina as 2 countries that have a large and well-integrated populations of Italian descent today. There's also a large amount of internal migration, most notably from the south to the north, because the north industrialized more through the 20th century, so there are increased job opportunities there. Also from the northeast to the northwest, because the northwest specifically industrialized the most. And this mixing of Italians from different parts of the country increased national cohesion and identity. But immigration from Italy wasn't, she calls it commemorated through the 20th century through the 20th century mainly. For example, I grew up in California, so I am aware of, for example, Native Americans and a bit of their history in California, but education in Italy didn't emphasize immigrants very much, so Italians haven't been as aware of it. This has affected how they accept immigrants to their country today. Immigration to Italy has ramped up notably from the 1990s. The most visible example is North African migrants crossing the Mediterranean by boat. Depicted on the right is a capsized boat, unfortunately, from a few years ago. But in reality, immigrants come from many different countries. Many of them work low-wage jobs, which in fact benefits local economies because that keeps employers in Italy instead of moving overseas. But many native Italians view immigrants as problematic. She raises a couple possible reasons for this. First, Italy didn't really build a large colonial empire, so these immigrants don't have really any colonial link to Italy. And of course, they come from a lot of different places too. Second, the immigrants often don't have documentation, so they can't seek regular employment, so they have to seek illegal employment, and that makes them more susceptible to commit crimes. So there is a perception of criminality associated with immigrants. Right-wing politicians make policies and campaign based on these fears. For example, Silvio Berlusconi in the 2000s campaigned on many Italians' disdain or fear for immigrants. But they don't always consistently follow through with these policies. For example, his administration had a policy of turning back migrants who came over the Mediterranean Sea, but his administration continued to accept immigrants via other methods, which kind of goes to show that politicians across the spectrum are aware that immigrants will come to Italy anyway, and that they aren't necessarily detrimental to the country. Another example is the Mare Nostrum effort in the mid-2010s, which sought to decrease the number of deaths in migrants across the Mediterranean Sea. But of course, that was implemented by a left-center government, and then the next right-wing government significantly downsized that effort. So there's a sort of push back and forth on this issue in politics today. The last issue is citizenship. Descendants of immigrants with Italian ancestry in other countries can easily get citizenship today, but immigrants from other countries who are living in Italy face much stricter rules. Adults have to have to have lived in Italy legally for 10 years before being eligible for citizenship. Children have had to reach the age of 18 first. This has changed under recent leadership in the mid-2010s. Now they face more lax rules for citizenship. Interestingly, the Catholic Church is more open to immigrants than the major political parties are, and they have been providing service and assistance to them. So the summary is, throughout the 20th century, Italian immigrants were eventually accepted into other countries, and they have formed vibrant communities there. But immigrants into Italy today are still not very easily accepted. This slight lack of willingness to change is also reflected in another example she brings up, the LGBT community. Political stances and cultural perceptions of them, including in the Catholic Church, have only slowly been moving in recent years. So Italy has rather a bit slow to adjust to its already diversifying population on multiple fronts.
People of the Italian diaspora from 1789 to 1914 were known as Gli Italiani nel mondo, Italians of the world. These were people who migrated to different parts of the world and created a global network of social connections to their homeland. The motivation for this mass migration was the search for work. In the US today, we think that current immigration to our country is unlike anything seen before, but actually it isn't all that unique if we look back at history. During this early era of migration, about 150 million migrants, that's 10% of the world's population in 1900, immigrated to different nations. Only 35 million of those were to the United States, and less than a third of those were Italians. The Italian diaspora included about 16 million Italians who left Italy during this era. That's about 2/3 of Italy's population in 1861. About half of those migrants found work in Europe, while about a third migrated to North America and a quarter went to South America. Some also immigrated to Australia and North and South Africa. The vast majority were male Italian migrants who were unskilled peasants and workers, street traders, or the smallest landowners. Most of them found work in construction, mining, and plantations or large-scale commercial agriculture. Few of these jobs actually supported permanent settlement. Female Italians migrated at much lower numbers. Those that did immigrate were usually joining men abroad and took jobs in women's industries such as making cigars, textiles, spinning, and weaving. Because the majority of women didn't immigrate as the men did, many Italians remained connected to Italy no matter where they immigrated to. One of the big influences was the emancipation of African workers. This created a huge demand for labor, and in the majority of cases, it was those that were born and living in economic insecurity who would fill these massive gaps in the labor market. While this time had massive immigration movements from a lot of countries, few had as large a migration as Italy if you look at the numbers of those who left versus the overall population of that country. Another unique aspect of Italians who migrated was their attachment to their homeland. Unlike other groups such as the Irish with the potato famine, Italians, about 50% of those that immigrated actually returned to Italy. While other European countries saw migration, Italians often fell into debt in order to migrate and served on plantations and other less desired jobs. These jobs were some of the most unethical. Due to the types of jobs they took, Italian immigrants often worked along with Chinese immigrants and actually were known as the Chinese of Europe. Another way in which Italian immigrants differed from other European migrants is that the United States was really not their preferred destination most of the time. Northern Italians actually preferred Europe and Latin America, while Southern Italians did end up going to the US in larger numbers. In the first decades of the 20th century, Italian migrants spent their springs and summers paving streets, laying tracks for streetcars, digging tunnels for railroads, sewers, and subways, and constructing urban water systems. They built bridges and factories, tenements and department stores, and skyscrapers in cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Cleveland, and Chicago. In the South, they usually did seasonal work as sugarcane harvesters and grinders, and then as track men for the Gulf Coast rail lines. Permanent work in the US was hard to find, but beginning in the 1890s, mines in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Illinois, Alabama, Colorado, Nevada, and Utah began to provide permanent employment. California was really the only place where significant numbers of Italian migrants became farmers and settlers, working as gardeners and wine and fruit growers. Latin America actually offered better jobs to most other locations. Before 1902, whole families from rural regions around Venice took contracts with Brazil's coffee plantations in exchange for free passage. This was all paid for by the Brazilian government. In Latin and South America, large numbers of Italians became independent farmers and often became investors and businessmen. So unlike the US and Canada, Italians in Argentina and Brazil became the largest part of the industrial working class, and they dominated the middle class. Argentina turned out to be much more of a land of opportunity for Italians than the United States. Today, 40% of Argentina's citizens are of Italian descent, whereas in the US and Canada, only about 5% of our population is of Italian descent.
Hi all, I'll be reviewing the assigned novel titled Vita by Melania Mazzucco. She's an Italian author born in Rome, Italy. This book, Vita, actually landed her the Strega Prize in 2003, Italy's most prestigious literary reward. A brief introduction to this book. It is based off her ancestral history, but overall is fictionalized. We can see this perspective of her seeking to learn information about the lives of her ancestors through different chapters in the book, found sporadically throughout, in which she recounts stories, photographs, dates, and other interesting information about the book's characters. Now to summarize the plot of the book. So this book tells the story of Italian immigrants as they adjust to new life in New York in the early 1900s. Vita and Diamante, two young children, step off of the boat to begin their lives in New York. Not before long, both children are faced with the harsh and unforgiving living and working conditions that America has to offer for them. The boarding house they reside in for the first while in America is small and cramped, dirty, reeks of various smells, and houses a lot of different boarders who work long hours for meager pay. Several jobs throughout the novel include selling newspapers on the street, making fake roses, working for the railroads, mining, and other demanding jobs with no benefits and small wages. The characters reveal hopes of becoming rich, accessing all America has to offer, and sending letters back home to Italy with cash and inspiring words. They even go to lengths such as blackmailing and threatening businesses in order to extort money, or even robbing graves to make this happen. Their reality, especially in their youth, is much different. They arrived in America with nothing more than the old, ill-fitting clothes on their backs. Processed through Ellis Island, they're told to strip naked to reveal any items they're bringing to the country. Throughout the process, among thousands of others who hope America to be their refuge, they experience feelings of excitement and hope, as well as fear and anxiety. The young children, who made the long journey by sea for a new life, end up relying on each other more than anything. Various relationships emerge throughout the novel. We see Vita's changing relationship with Agnolo as she finally accepts him as her father. We see the relationship between Agnolo and Lena and how that affects the climate of the boarding house. There are also various relationships among the boarders themselves: family, cousins, friends, enemies, and lovers. The most important relationship in the novel is between Vita and Diamante. As children, they develop romantic feelings for each other. Diamante leaves to work for the railroads as a water boy, and Vita is sent to reform school for a few years. He writes to her, hopeful that in no time he'll have the money to leave and go start a life with her. She commits to waiting for him. When he doesn't receive any postcards back from her, Diamante begins to believe that she had given up on him. A few years later, he returns to New York when he's escaped his railroad contract, just to see that Vita has moved on with Rocco, a boarder that they had both lived with. Diamante swears off thinking about her and does his best to move on. They both marry, and Vita ends up becoming a successful restaurant owner, while Diamante eventually returns to Italy. Towards the end of the book, both widowed, Vita travels to Italy to find Diamante and ask him to come live with her so they can enjoy the rest of their lives. Throughout the novel, there were several references to aspects of Italian culture that we've talked about in class. For example, references to the mafia, such as their goals, their techniques that they use, are present throughout the novel. Threatening businesses for money, sending out hitmen, and the rampant crime in their New York neighborhood are some examples. There are also several references to Catholicism and religion, including the belief in God, prayer, sacraments, and marriage. Another salient reference throughout the novel is the characters and their Italian identities. They're always very aware of this through their language, their appearance, and their overall situation in America. Some people even change their Italian names to sound more American. Some overall themes I want to touch on are the idea of assimilation to American culture and values. We see Vita go to school, learn English words, and teach Diamante so he can have better job opportunities. There's a constant pull between the opportunities that America supposedly can offer them and what they must do to access those, versus their Italian heritage, Italian roots, and their desire to return home. So both assimilation and identity are present. There's also the sense of disillusionment, most noticeably with Diamante throughout his time in America. He saw how hard Italians worked in these low-paying, dangerous, demanding jobs that no one else wanted. Just to barely get by, never get enough savings to send back to his family, or realize the life that he came for. We see him decide to move back to Italy as he feels America has nothing more to offer him. Sometimes he wishes he never even came in the first place. This struggle is represented throughout the contrasting ideas of opportunity and despair. Overall, the book tells the story of Italian immigrants and what many experienced during the Italian diaspora.
To continue, we can also observe Italian diaspora through Pan e Cioccolata, made by Franco Bruzzati in 1978. This translates to Bread and Chocolate. This film was a comedy and a drama and was very popular amongst its times for showing and being realistic of how Italian immigration was back in the day. Some of the main characters we see throughout the movie is Giovanni Carfaldo, also known as Nino, who plays an Italian immigrant in Switzerland. There's also some side characters who is a Turk, who plays as his competition in the restaurant that they both work at. There is Elena, who is a Greek refugee and helps out Nino by helping him stay at her place, and an Italian industrialist. The plot of this movie entails of Nino, an Italian immigrant who is in his probation time as a waitress job in Switzerland. To keep his work permit and be allowed to stay in Switzerland, he must prove he is better than the Turk. After a long day, Nino makes a bad decision and is caught urinating in public, which then leads his work permit to be revoked. Desperately, he seeks for other jobs and remembers of an Italian industrialist who stopped by at the restaurant he worked at, who might be able to help him. The industrialist does indeed hire him as his personal butler. However, after some time, the industrialist commits suicide after finding out he's bankrupt. As a result, Nino is left to look for another job in the poultry industry. And while spending some time with the new family who hired him in the poultry industry, Nino was influenced into bleaching his hair blonde to fit in with the rest of society, thinking that he would have better opportunities and people would treat him better. However, he quickly realizes that looks do not hide who he truly is and comes to terms with accepting his own culture and being proud of who he is despite others' ideas. This film sheds light to Italian diaspora through some of its themes. For example, at the beginning of the movie where Nino is conversating with another waiter about Italian discrimination. Nino's coworker sees it's unfair that Swiss people treated the working class and Italians as less. However, without the working class, the wealthier would not be able to have all the luxuries that they get and just basics such as food. Also, in the view of the Italians consider themselves lucky because they're better off than they would be if they stayed home. Some of the opportunities that they get would not present themselves back home. Ultimately, this movie shows the good and the bad of moving away, but more specifically, how it is during these times for Italians and even now in some areas. It displays the struggles of migrating for a better future and facing discrimination, as well as the struggle of being unfamiliar with new surroundings, which we can see led Nino to some bad decisions.